Good evening, folks. It's time to find a seat. So if our faculty can help students find their way to a seat. Oh, you all got quiet too. That's nice. Well, I'm George Freeman, as I said earlier, the Dean of Evening Weekend Studies, our summer programs in the Grays Harbor College. I welcome all of you this evening. I'm really glad that you could make it. We're going to start this evening with one of our students who's soon to be a graduate, Joe Seymour, who's of the Squaxin Island tribe, and we asked him if he would do a welcome song. So with that, I will turn this over to him. He's about to graduate this next year, and he is in the program Decolonization of the Pacific Rim. So with that, thank you. Yeah.
Yo, 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 hey, yo, hey.
Our thanks to Joe. And I'd like to read now something written by Andy Siebert to help us ground ourselves in the place we are now, in the place that we belong. We begin our time together today by acknowledging the indigenous people of the Medicine Creek Treaty, whose land was stolen and on which the college stands. The treaty was signed in 1854 by the governor and the chiefs of 9 local tribes, including the Nisqually, the Puyallup, the Steilacoom, as well as the Squaxin people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. This was the first of 4 agreements during that time, signed by over 60 tribal leaders relinquishing 2.5 million acres in exchange for 3 reservations and $32,500. We honor the trees, the water, the land, and the environment in which we get to learn, work, and grow. We pay respect to elders, past and present, of the Squaxin Island tribe and extend that respect to other Native people present. So with that, welcome to the Evening Weekend Studies Liberal Arts Forum. So glad that you could all make it. The purpose of the EWS Liberal Arts Forum is to bring the community together of EWS students, their faculty and staff, and for community members so we can discuss matters that impact our lives, both locally and globally. It allows us as a community to meet and discuss ideas from our different perspectives as informed by the work of our academic programs. Perhaps of even greater essence, it allows us a moment of gathering as a community, opportunities that are far too rare to reflect on the current condition of the world. So that is our hope for this evening in terms of our work. We have a great speaker, Dr. Roy Scranton, who will be here. We have a lot of good activities. I hope you got a little bit warmed up with the food this evening. So, before we go on, I want to give thanks to Joe once again for his opening greeting song, to Tina and Laura of the Longhouse, to our media services, to Aramark in terms of the food that they provided tonight, to our facilities folks who set up all of this right here, the EWS faculty, of course, who got you all to come here. Thanks to our Veterans Center, who Randy Kelly, and they helped support this and co-sponsor the event tonight. Derek Steinhoff and the Critical and Cultural Theory Lecture Series, to the Office of Inclusion with Dr. Chastity Holloman Douglas, and to our Provost's Office and Dr. Jen Drake. And of course, we always have to ask, thank you. You're our students. This is about you, and this should be an experience and hopefully something that you walk away from with new ideas, with new ways of looking at the world, and with a sense of rejoicing about who you are. You know, EWS students are a little different breed, if you want to sort of think of it that way. You all work long and hard at your jobs and raising your families, and then you come and you do a lot of work in the evening. And it's hard sometimes. I've been in some of your classes sitting there watching you, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and yet there you are engaging fully, really doing the hard work of earning this degree. So I thank you all for being a part of this community. At this point, I'd like to call up some other folks that we'd like to recognize. So if I could get Randy to come up, and Ray to come up, and Edwin, could you come up here? Please. Where's Edwin? Oh, there he is, coming from my right side there. Of course. So for this evening, we wanted to recognize some of the folks who thoroughly support the work of Evening Weekend Studies. So I've asked Edwin Bliss to come tonight, who's in career development, Ray Mobley, who's with our admissions, and Randy Kelly in the Veterans Office. And for you all, we've created a point of recognition and a plaque to acknowledge the work that you do for us, the presence in our community, and to let you know how much we value you. So we want to thank you for your hard work. Great, thank you. So these are the folks you need to connect with whenever you have a need in particular. So then there's one other person who I have to thank, and that's Tricia Bateman. So Tricia, where are you? Come on up here. Yeah, give Tricia a hand. So I don't know if you all know who Tricia is. She is the program coordinator for Evening Weekend Studies. But for me, I'm going to get really emotional. I've been sort of on the edge of emotion all week. So anyway, for me, she is the stalwart leader of Evening Weekend Studies in terms of helping me understand as the dean the complexities of our curriculum, the kinds of the patterns and experiences that our students and our faculty have. And basically, I just need to let you know, she's the person, she's the go-to person for most everything. So when I get to stand up here and sort of show off a little bit about how well I can articulate ideas perhaps and introduce speakers, I want you to know that the person who stands and whose shoulders I stand on is Tricia. So Tricia, we've created for you as well a plaque and a recognition and appreciation. So do you want to say a couple of words?
I'm not really much of a speaker, but I'll say thank you so much. I really enjoy working with the students and helping get things going and helping you guys find what you need, and I'm always here to answer questions if you need anything, and to help you find resources if you need them, which I know isn't always the easiest for this student group. So in those nice cards that George has gone around at the beginning of the quarter, my contact information's on them. I'm always in the dean's area, and I'm always happy to help, and I'm happy to be here, and thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. All right, so I want to review just a little bit the format here. I think most of you already know the format, but basically what's going to happen next is that our provost, Dr. Jen Drake, is going to introduce our speaker, and after that, he's going to speak for a bit, because that's his job. And then after he finishes that, about 20 or 30 minutes, then you're all going to turn to one another, and using the prompts that we have here, you're going to begin a seminar. And in that seminar, we want you to utilize the prompts here as effectively as you can, but also through your process, start thinking about the questions that you might want to ask in terms of Roy Scranton, what he can speak to in terms of his writings, in terms of his beliefs, his understandings, and his thinking. So with that, if I may introduce Dr. Jennifer Drake, come on up. Now, Jen should be accustomed to this because she's been at all of our community forward events for the most part, and every time I get to introduce her, I always say, so I have to let you know, Jen's a great provost. You really have to understand. I'm a clinical psychologist and organization systems development guy, so it's always amazing when you get to sit down and watch someone foreign to any kind of a system, right? Not knowing how Evergreen really works. And I've been able to watch across the last 7 months as she's been here, her ability to capture in just minutes the whole and complete picture that we're providing her, and start to move towards, which is the incredible part, starts to move towards the kinds of action and solutions that truly fit our community, to understand our culture, and to move forward in a culture that, in many ways, is so complex and difficult to hold. I always just marvel at it. So, Jen, I had to say that about you because I always want to appreciate you, and with that, I'm going to turn the mic over. So.
Thank you. Well, and since George is appreciating everyone, I think we need to appreciate George. George does an amazing work for all of us. I love his invitational, open nature. And I'm really happy to be here with you tonight. I'm sitting in, not as often as I would like, but I'm sitting in on a Culture as History, which is an evening weekend studies program. Yeah! And I really am enjoying getting to know the evening weekend studies community. So, and it's also my pleasure then to introduce Dr. Roy Scranton to you tonight. Dr. Scranton is Assistant Professor of English at Notre Dame with specialties in creative nonfiction, fiction, literary journalism, war writing, environmental humanities, and 20th century American literature. His essays, journalism, short fiction, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Nation, Dissent, Lit, Los Angeles Review of Books, and Boston Review. His first book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, was published by City Lights Books in 2015. His novel, War Porn, was released by Soho Press in August 2016 and was called one of the best and most disturbing war novels in years by Sam Sachs in the Wall Street Journal. He has also co-edited the anthology, Fire and Forget, Short Stories from the Long War. Dr. Scranton's literary honors include a Mrs. Giles G. Whiting Fellowship in the Humanities, received in 2014, and a Lannan Literary Fellowship, received in 2017. His New York Times essay, Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene, appeared in The Best American Science and Nature Writing 2014, and his essay, The Terror of the New, was selected as a notable essay in Best American Essays 1915. Dr. Scranton brings his personal experiences in the Iraqi War, his critical analysis of climate change, and his thorough reading of texts, past and current, to evaluate the human condition. He'd make a great Evergreen student. And people were actually asking me if he was an alum as they were getting to know your work. His writings urge us to ponder how we make meaning of life, how we affect change, and how we come to grips with the inevitable death of ourselves and our civilization. Hence the provocative title of his talk tonight, We're Doomed, Now What? I personally look forward to hearing Dr. Scranton's answer to that daunting question. Please join me in welcoming him to the 2018 EWS Liberal Arts Forum. Thank you.
I think that's yours.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that introduction. And I want to thank as well George Freeman and Patricia Bateman for your work bringing me here, the invitation, the evening and weekend studies program. It's great to be back in Olympia. I lived here for a little while, worked for Washburg, you might know. And it always feels like coming home to see the trees and the always gloomy gray sky, and to pass under the exit for Slater-Kinney Road. It makes my heart skip a little bit. I want to thank Joe as well for that, for honoring us with his song, and offer my respect to the native peoples who inhabited this land. I also want to offer my respect to all of you, evening and weekend study students. I myself am a non-traditional student. I was a college dropout, first-generation college student, dropped out of college at the University of Puget Sound, and it took me years. It took me about 10 years to get back to school, and I did it through the Army and then through evening classes at the New School in New York. And so 10 years ago, I'm not an alum of Evergreen, but you're my people, So I applaud you. I know it's a lot of work, and it makes getting that diploma that much more meaningful. So, congratulations and my applause and respect to you. With that, I'll just go on, and I'll try not to go over my time. I'm gonna make sure we have time to talk. We had some bad Chinese takeout, and my partner, Sarah, woke in the night holding her belly. "What time is it?" she said. "Write down the time." Within a few hours, contractions were coming on strong, a full 60 seconds every 4 minutes. So we called the hospital and texted our doula and grabbed our go bag and drove. The next morning, after 27 hours of labor and 5 hours of pushing, after 9 months of worrying and hoping and looking at ultrasound scans, after years of deliberating and wondering and negotiating between the demands of being on the academic job market and our deeper biological cycles, a new human emerged into the world, yowling like something feral. Our daughter. Tears broke from my eyes as I hugged her and Sarah together, my chest opening like I'd found the ultimate source of joy in the universe and plugged in, streaming total utopian agape. First, I cried for joy. Then I cried for sorrow. A few minutes later, holding my daughter, Rosalind, and looking out the window over the hospital parking lot, the rows of cars, the strip mall across the street, the flat, ugly Rust Belt sprawl of northwest Indiana, box stores and drive-thrus, drainage ditches and concrete and waste fields that might have once been oak groves, a world in which the landscape was ravaged and brutalized as a matter of course, in which any possibility for living in harmony with nature had been all but evacuated, in which the miracle of life was measured in dollars. Birds and bees and frogs were all dying. The seasons were out of joint, and instead of grieving, people wandered like zombies, dull eyes glued to soul-sucking screens. My partner and I had, in our selfishness, doomed our child to life on a dystopian planet, like some science fiction refugee, and there was no way I could see to shield her from the storms looming on the horizon. "I'm sorry," I told her, weeping as her tiny fingers gripped mine. "I'm sorry you have to live in this broken world." Anyone who pays much attention to climate scientists or to reporting by journalists on climate change knows that the outlook is grim. It's a tired story by this point, since people like James Hansen have been warning us for 30 years, but it goes like this. Waste carbon dioxide from burned fossil fuels is accumulating in the atmosphere and trapping solar energy, which is warming the planet at an astonishing rate. This global warming is radically transforming environmental conditions all over the planet, leading to a range of second-order effects, including rising seas, destabilized crop yields, mass extinction, unpredictable and dangerously intense storms, drought, floods, heat waves, etc. The stress these effects are putting on human political, economic, social, and agricultural infrastructure will eventually be greater than anything we've seen since the 20th century's 2 world wars, and will probably outstrip those. It's not unreasonable to say that the challenge we live with today is the greatest the human species has ever faced. Anyone who pays much attention to politics can assume that we're almost certainly going to botch this challenge. The radical reorientation of all human economic and social production necessary to stop emitting waste carbon dioxide completely within the next 5 or 10 years is scarcely imaginable, much less feasible. It would demand centralized control of key economic sectors, massive state investment in carbon capture and sequestration, and global coordination on a scale never before seen, at the very moment when the post-war political and economic structures that held the capitalist world together under American leadership are splintering, and extremist libertarians are dismantling the nation-state from the inside. The very idea of unified national political action toward a single goal seems farcical, and unified action on a global scale mere whimsy. What's more, even if tomorrow morning we woke to a world socialist revolution committed to ending human fossil fuel use within 5 years, significant and dangerous warming is already baked into the system from all the carbon dioxide we've already dumped. There's a time lag between CO2 increase and subsequent warming effects, between the wind we sow and the whirlwind we reap. Our lives are lived in that gap. My daughter was born there. Barring a miracle, the next 20 years are going to see increasingly chaotic systemic transformation in global climate patterns, unpredictable biological adaptation, and a wild range of human political and economic responses. These likely trends pose unanswerable dilemmas. Should I start a 529 college savings fund for my daughter in the hopes that there will still be a stock market and a working system of higher education? Or would she be better served by learning to shoot, hunt, and live off the land? Should we raise her where we live now, Indiana, a state on the cutting edge of privatization where public services like school buses and 911 call centers and highways are failing and unreliable, but our middle-class income allows us to own a home? Or should we try to move back to one of the blue bubble cities that still have some sense of public good, but where we'd struggle just to pay rent, and rising seas, storms, wildfires, and drought threaten even the wealthiest? There are no clear answers. Every choice is a gamble. The next 20 years will be tough. After that, it gets worse. The middle and later decades of the 21st century, my daughter's adult life, promise a global catastrophe whose full implications any reasonable person must turn away from in horror. Recall that World War II, including the Holocaust and other atrocities, saw about 3% of the entire global population annihilated. It staggers not only the mind, but the very soul to imagine what going through a population bottleneck that entailed losing 70% of the human species would look like. But that's what it would take to get us back to population levels circa 1940. Why 1940? Over the past 70 years, the human species has burst the boundary conditions for sustainable life on Earth through what some scientists call the Great Acceleration, an unprecedented spike in socioeconomic and Earth systems trends from carbon dioxide emissions, surface temperature, and tropical forest loss to fertilizer consumption, water use, and population. So from approximately 2.3 billion in 1940 to 7.6 billion today, a spike which represents, quote, the most anomalous and unrepresentative period in the 200,000-year-long history of relations between our species and the biosphere, in the words of J.R. McNeill and Peter Engleke. And while we might hope that world leaders will correct course and somehow bring this great acceleration under control, human history suggests this global bubble will burst like every other in crisis, chaos, and violence. One thing is certain, as McNeill and Engeleke testify, the great acceleration in its present form cannot last for long. On the other side of the inevitable correction, 100 years from now, whatever Homo sapiens are left on Earth are going to be scrambling to adapt to a hot, unstable, and hostile planet. Why would anyone choose to bring new life into this world? How can I explain my decision to my daughter, now cursed to live out this fate? And isn't there anything we can do about it? It's true that numerous engineering solutions exist that might help decrease and mitigate carbon emissions, but the social and economic costs of these solutions are so unclear and contentious that widespread agreement on implementation seems practically impossible. Meanwhile, our political system has been hijacked by thieves interested only in looting the republic and undermining democratic rule. Faced with such systemic failures, many adopt the individualist approach that consumer capitalism inherited from Protestant theology and argue that it's up to each of us individually to make the personal sacrifices necessary to stop global warming. According to a widely cited 2017 research letter by Seth Wines and Kimberly Nicholas, the most effective things any of us can do to decrease carbon emissions are to eat a plant-based diet, avoid flying, live car-free, and have one fewer child, with the latter choice having the most significant impact by far. Wines and Nicholas argue for teaching these values in high school, thus transforming society through education. The real problem with this isn't with their specific recommendations or with the idea of teaching thrift, which is all well and good, but rather with the social model their recommendations rely on. Contra Adam Smith and Margaret Thatcher, society is not simply an aggregate of millions or billions of individual choices, but a complex recursive dynamic in which choices are made within institutions and ideologies, which then subtly change over time as these choices feed back into the structures that limit what we consider possible, all the while being disrupted and nudged and warped by countless internal and external drivers, including environmental factors such as global warming, material and social innovation, and the occasional widespread panic. Which is just to say that we're not free to decide how we live any more than we are free to break the laws of physics. We choose from possible options, not ex nihilo. I would love to avoid flying and to live car-free. Seriously, I can't even properly express my loathing for flying without getting vulgar. And I lived without a car for several years in my 20s and early 30s, so I know that's possible. But my world then was largely limited to the range I could walk or bike or get to on public transit. My work was usually casual and close by, and I spent way too much time dragging groceries back home. Now, like most Americans, I live and work in a city that was built for cars and has abysmal public transit, and which also happens to be thousands of miles away from my extended family and my oldest friends. No car, no job, no flying, no Thanksgiving with the family. As for a plant-based diet, I could and perhaps should go vegan, though my years as a vegetarian showed me that totally foregoing meat leaves me depressed and enervated. I can do it, but it's a sacrifice I'm reluctant to accept despite knowing the moral and ecological costs of factory farming. As for not having a child, of course nobody needs to have children. No human being ever needed to propagate the species. Biological reproduction is completely unnecessary. It just happens to be the strongest drive humans have, the fundamental organizing principle of every human culture and the sine qua non of a meaningful human world, since it alone makes possible the persistence of human meaning through time. My wife and I didn't need to have a child, but without one, our lives lacked something important. Not unbearably, of course, but we wanted there to be more. We wanted life to go on. To take Wines and Nicholas's recommendations to heart, would mean cutting oneself off from the mainstream of human life. It would mean choosing a hermetic, isolated existence with a restricted diet and giving up any deep connection to the future. I know because I've lived like that, and sometimes even daydream about returning to it. Everything seemed so pure, so simple. But like most of us, I can't or won't. I'm committed to this world, the world I live in all its stupidity and doom, because this world is the one everyone else lives in too. My colleagues and students, my friends and family, my partner and daughter. This world is the only one in which my choices have meaning. Furthermore, taking Wines and Nicholas's argument seriously would mean acknowledging that the only truly moral response to global climate change is to commit suicide. Think about it. There's simply no more effective way to shrink your carbon footprint. Once you're dead, you won't use any more electricity, you won't eat any more meat, you won't burn any more gasoline, and you certainly won't have any more children. If you really want to save the planet, you should die. And I, for one, would salute you. Such self-sacrifice would be admirable, even heroic, to die for the sake of the human world, but it won't save us. History is full of people whose commitment to spiritual ideals led them to such self-sacrifice, from war heroes to self-immolating Buddhist monks to Christian martyrs. But the wheel of suffering has never stopped spinning. Even if millions went vegan, swore off airplanes, sold their cars, and had themselves sterilized, it wouldn't significantly slow down global warming. Billions of human beings already live a subsistence existence right now, and most carbon waste is due to a small percentage of people who don't seem to care much about the consequences. Recalling Thorstein Veblen's theory of conspicuous consumption, we might even speculate that the freedom to pollute is a kind of status marker, a point Michel Serres makes in his book Malfaisance. If that's right, then we can assume that the wealthy parasites killing the planet are never going to give up their privileged, destructive habits, because those very habits are how they maintain their sense of self-worth. The real choice we all face is not what to buy, whether to fly, or whether to have children, but whether we are willing to commit to living ethically in a broken world, a world in which human beings are dependent for collective survival on a kind of ecological grace. There is no utopia, no planet B, no salvation, no escape. We're all stuck here in the same shithole together. And living in that world, the only one there is, means giving up any claims to innocence or moral purity, since to live at all means to cause suffering. While you could, if you had the will for it, go off the grid, your subsistence farm would still be a tiny holocaust for the pests who would seek to live off your bounty. Your land deed would still need to be recognized by the imperialist state, and you would almost certainly need to enslave animals, if not for food and material, such as milk, leather, and bone, then at least for labor. Living ethically means understanding that one's actions have consequences, taking responsibility for how those consequences ripple out across the web of life in which we are each irrevocably enmeshed, and making the effort every day to ease what suffering you can. Living ethically means limiting your own desires, respecting the deep interdependence of all things in nature, and honoring the fact that our existence on this planet is a gift that comes from nowhere and may be taken back at any time without warning. I chose to have a child with my partner because I believe in human life, because I want the wheel of life to keep turning. I believe in old people dying and new people being born. I believe in the sun rising and setting. I believe in winter giving way to spring and summer bending to fall. I believe in the season's first robin, the first snow, and the first cherry blossoms bursting and falling from the trees. I believe in squirrels chasing each other through the branches, possums awkwardly mating, and knobbly-kneed fawns bounding through open meadows. Sometimes I think focusing on the horror of our coming civilizational collapse is just a way for me to avoid the grief I feel at losing the natural cycles and biological rhythms that climate change is already beginning to warp. The seasons are confused, the animals are confused, and nothing feels right. Not the land, not the weather. But for all my grief and horror, I can't seem to let go of the dumb hope that we might somehow find the wisdom to live within our natural ecological limits. It's not really rational. Politically, realistically, making mass human life sustainable at this point would demand a world socialist revolution, since only a unified world government committed to radical economic redistribution and ecological justice would be able to initiate and manage transitioning the global economy off fossil fuels. Socially, spiritually, we need to throw away our bedazzling high-tech toys and turn our gaze back to the land, the air, the water, the rhythms of this world, and the other beings who live there. We need a world religion that worshipped Mother Earth and put harmony with nature over all other virtues. While we're at it, we should also probably put women in charge, get rid of nuclear weapons, and outlaw racial and ethnic discrimination. I could spin out the fantasy further, my own private utopia, and maybe that's a fine way to pass the time until we die. It's certainly a venerable tradition, from Plato's Republic down to the sophists of Silicon Valley. But I doubt we'll see anything like it come to fruition. I'm pretty sure we're going to keep fumbling along toward our doom, just like we fumbled our way into taking over the planet. Human beings are dependable like that. Nevertheless, the impossibility of utopian solutions to the problem of climate change or to the problem of being human doesn't signify the end of ethical thought, but its beginning. For it's only in recognizing the fact that our lives are limited, complicit, imperfect, and interdependent that we begin to understand what it means to live together in this world. When my daughter was born, I felt a love and connection I'd never felt before, a surge of tenderness and care, harrowing in its intensity. I knew in a moment that I would kill for her, I would die for her, sacrifice anything for her. And while those feelings have become more bearable since the first delirious days after her birth, they have not abated. And when I think of the future she's doomed to live out, the future we've created, I'm filled with rage and sorrow. Every day brings new pangs of grief. I'm excited to see the world afresh through my child's eyes, as any parent would be, but have found her every new discovery haunted by death. Reading to her from Polar Bear, what do you hear? I can't help but marvel at the disconnect between the animal life represented in that book and the planet-wide mass extinction going on right now. When I sing along with Elizabeth Mitchell doing Froggy Went a Courtin', I can't help but feel like I'm betraying Rosalind by filling her brain with fantastic images of a magical non-human world, when the actual non-human world has been exploited and despoiled. How can I read her Winnie the Pooh or The Wind in the Willows when I know the pastoral life they portray is lost to us forever? And how soon do I explain to her what's happening? In all the most important ways, it's already too late. There's no way to win this game, no way to hack life in a doomed world. I can't protect my daughter from the future, and I can't even promise her a better life. All I can do is teach her how to care, how to be kind, and how to live within nature's grace. I can teach her to be tough but resilient, adaptable and prudent, because she's going to have to struggle for what she needs. But I also need to teach her to fight for what's right, because none of us are in this alone. I need to teach her that all things die, even her and me and her mother and the world we know, but that coming to terms with this difficult truth is the beginning of wisdom. Trying to raise some Katniss Everdeen or Jedi Rey, however, isn't enough. Offloading responsibility for the world onto future generations is ethically inexcusable, precisely the kind of short-term selfish behavior that led us to this precipice and illogical to boot. Our children learn early to distinguish what we do from what we say, and they model their own behaviors on the former, not the latter. So no matter how much we talk about children being the future, if we keep acting like their future is disposable, then they'll take that action for truth, regardless of how convincing we find our own hypocrisy. But there are even bigger issues with seeing climate change as the future's problem instead of our own. One is time. One of the reasons coming to terms with climate change is so difficult is because it takes time. It unfolds in time. And we're not that good at foreseeing trend lines that go against our narratives of how things should be. We tend to rely on two kinds of temporality, which the ancient Greeks called chronos and kairos. We might call them day-to-day time and event time. In day-to-day time, we tend to assume everything is going to be much the same as it was yesterday, within the predictable cycles of change to which we've become accustomed. The sun will rise and fall, we'll get up and go to work, we'll get a bunch of emails and take too long to answer them, while football gives way to basketball, and we celebrate the various shopping holidays that mark our calendar: Memorial Day, Prime Day, Black Friday, Christmas. And children get older and go to college and have their own children and eventually disappear into retirement homes. The regular unfolding of life as we conceive it is the basis for our sense of normality, the frame that shapes our decisions, and the implicit backdrop against which we judge new information. In event time, on the other hand, day-to-day rhythms are suspended. A carnivalesque mood takes over. Our social structures reveal themselves as the willed collective illusions they are, and we see ourselves emerge for a moment into an open clearing of nearly infinite possibility. Event time is precisely the moment of action in crisis, the now when everything can change. These two kinds of temporality constitute a dynamic, dialectical back and forth in which everything is normal until it isn't, and then there's a new normal. Unfortunately for us, and somewhat ironically, climate change doesn't fit this temporal dynamic, because climate change is a gradual process happening year by year, punctuated not by one global transformational event, but by an unpredictable series of increasingly damaging local disasters. Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, the monsoon floods in India and Bangladesh that killed more than 1,000 people, the California wildfires of 2017, any one of these catastrophes might have been the event which changed everything, except that each one was, in the end, no more than a regional phenomena. None of them achieved the universality of a true event, that quality which, for example, led the French newspaper Le Monde to declare after 9/11 that nous sommes tous américains, we are all American. There is as yet no universal we who might respond to climate change, only an abstract we who are all going to die in our individual ways. For most of us, the day-to-day time of global capitalist civilization remains the beating pulse of our lives, even as the world around us crumbles and changes into something strange and awful. By the time the event we seem to be waiting for happens, we will have already lost too much to be able to do much about it. By the time the moment of decision arrives, our fate will have already been sealed. Thus, even though we live in the gap between the wind and the whirlwind, taking that gap for a momentary reprieve is a mistake. The catastrophe is now, even if it's almost impossible for most of us to see that fact through the blinders of day-to-day time. And that very dissonance is perhaps the defining truth of our era, the key to its schizophrenic character, the red thread that connects #MeToo, the Middle East, Arctic sea ice collapse, Russian hacking, Black Lives Matter, Trumpism, the rise of the libertarian right and the socialist left, our seemingly insatiable desire for losing ourselves, binge-watching Netflix, the banality of our workaday lives, and the dramatic fever dreams we live out online. I could and will raise my daughter to be a member of the Vuvolini resistance, feeding her a diet of rad American women A to Z, Beyonce, and Mad Max Fury Road. But we still have to live through the next 20, 50, 70 years. More to the point, we need to get through the next 12 months, the next 6 weeks, the next 48 hours. The other major issue with framing climate change as our children's problem is that while some degree of warming now appears inevitable, the range of possible outcomes over the next century is wide enough, and the worst outcomes extreme enough, that there is some narrow hope revolutionary socioeconomic transformations today might save billions of human lives and preserve global civilization as we know it in more or less recognizable form. Compared against an all too real possibility that unchecked emissions, even over the short term, could lead to runaway greenhouse warming, making our planet literally uninhabitable for human beings and leading to human extinction. The range of possible outcomes decreases every day, shifting month by month toward the more apocalyptic end of the spectrum. And waiting 20 years, 15 years, even 5 years may well see the window for saving humanity slam shut. Our children will not face the choices we face. They won't have the opportunities we now have for action. They'll confront a range of outcomes whose limits were determined by the choices we made. So we're back to the problem of what to do. It seems clear that if we want to transform the global economy by shifting off fossil fuels to renewable and nuclear energy, supplemented with carbon capture and sequestration, then we need some kind of centralized control over the economy. We could start by nationalizing energy production and other major industries, expropriating and redistributing the wealth of the 1% so that it can be put to work for the rest of us, then joining together with the other nations of the world in a single government that sees the needs of all humans as equal, regardless of race, creed, color, sexual orientation, homeland, or gender. This world government would necessarily require the legal and military power to enforce its decrees however they were legislated, so it would also need to have a monopoly on force. First dismantle the plutocracy, then dismantle the nation state. If you think this sounds like socialism, you're not wrong. In a way, Trumpism has done us a great service by driving apart the contradictory poles of individual greed and collective good, which had been uneasily joined under capitalism, and forcing a new articulation of collective global political life free from the dead hand of the market. But the challenge of figuring out how we might form a world socialist government is almost as difficult a question as figuring out how to address climate change. Wars are fought over such questions. I just don't see any other option that offers a real chance for navigating and coping with global warming and its ramifications without risking apocalyptic devastation and human extinction. Non-binding treaties like the Paris Agreement aren't going to do it. Carbon markets aren't going to do it. Broken democracies like our own aren't going to do it. To be honest, though, having a child hasn't really inspired me to acts of self-sacrifice in the service of abstract and doubtful goals, such as a global socialist revolution. Rather the opposite. I've had to start thinking about schools, healthcare, housing, and investment in whole new ways. I feel a deep obligation to provide for my child's future within the structures of contemporary American society, which demands of me making some kind of uneasy peace with America's brutally hierarchical, racist, and individualist socioeconomic culture. This is how young radicals become middle-aged liberal hypocrites. My love for my daughter is overwhelming, fierce, and irrational, and consumer capitalism exploits that every day by insisting, demanding, cajoling, whispering in my ear that if I don't do everything I can to make sure my child has more than yours, more whatever, the best whatever, then she's going to fall behind. That if I don't push her to learn her alphabet before the other kids, she'll never pass the tests to get into the prestige kindergarten, which means she'll never get into college and she'll wind up wasting her life as a checker in a grocery store. That if I don't buy her the expensive wooden skill-building puzzle or the organic kale avocado puree, then I'm condemning her to a slippery slope of disappointment, failure, prostitution, and opioid addiction. It's true. The immense engines of capital, I have learned, have a whole array of forces that only activate once you've had children, and then they fall on you with the force of 1,000 suns. When I try to think about climate change from this perspective, the only thing I hear is, we're gonna need a bigger boat. It takes real effort to remind myself that there is no boat. I have to work to remember that my daughter's fate is not hers alone, but shared, inexorably, inevitably, despite the fact that the rich may be able to cope with climate change better than the poor, for a while. Money means you can flee so you don't get stuck in the Superdome. Money means you can rebuild your house after it's destroyed by wildfires or floods. Money means access to institutional and governmental resources hidden from the poor behind complex, unwelcoming bureaucracies. Money means you can prep for disasters with insurance, kitted out go bags, and second homes in Montana or New Zealand. But money won't stop the seas from rising or the wind from blowing. Money won't save the Arctic, and it won't save Miami. And once the system starts to fall apart, all those ones and zeros in their bank accounts will evaporate, and all the gold the preppers have carefully hidden for end times will be revealed for what it is, a not especially useful yellow rock. As I said before, the real choice we face is not what to buy, but rather whether we're willing to commit to living ethically in a broken world in which human beings are dependent for collective survival on ecological grace. Joining the Democratic Socialists of America might be a start. But then what? And what else? How do we live within this crisis? How do we change the world on a human scale? And how do we teach our children by example and not just with words and stories? I'm too much a Westerner, I'm the West Coast Westerner, to want to tell anyone how to live. Too much a child of pioneers, too much myself an individualist, committed a priori to the idea that each of us has to work out our own salvation, and skeptical of the claims of gurus who give you 12 easy rules to follow. But in the spirit of American can-do pragmatism, I will offer a few broad suggestions. First, we should organize locally and aggressively. This will not only connect us to our neighbors, but it's also the most likely path to world socialist revolution. It's extremely unlikely that we'll bring about a revolution from outside the system. As long as it's us and them, they have the guns, the laws, and the money, and will outmaneuver us every time. But as Trump has shown, the system itself is far more vulnerable to takeover than anyone had suspected. A socialist revolution from within now seems possible, but it's going to take dedicated cadres and bold individuals committed to a long-term strategy of dominating state and local governments while building a national and international movement. Second, and perhaps counterintuitively, we need to do less. Our daily lives are caught in manic cycles of pointless production and frenzied consumption, desperate bids for connection and whiplash reactions from your morning coffee, to your morning emails, to Twitter outrage and backlash, to the stiff drink or dank bud or pills you need to chill at night, all of it powering a vast cultural machine that feeds on our anger and fear as much as it feeds on coal, oil, and natural gas. One must labor in order to eat, it's true, and we must work to repair the broken world. But so much of what we do is unnecessary, unconsidered, and reactive that we live out our days distracted and drained and unfocused. Slow down, do less. Do the one thing that matters rather than the 15 that don't. Third, we should all meditate. Sit, stare at the wall and do nothing. Be nothing. 5 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, an hour, 6 hours, whatever you can manage. Attend to your breathing. Watch your thoughts and feelings rise and fall like the wind and rain. Watch your mind chase itself, wrap itself in knots, and remember that your thoughts are not you. Your feelings are not you. Human existence is a circuit of desire and suffering. Suffering arises from desire, desire arises in reaction to suffering, and fulfilling your desires satisfies you for a moment, then leads inevitably to more suffering and more desire. The way to learn to live with this fundamental dilemma is by practicing detachment, learning to disidentify from your desires, and slowing your reactions until they become conscious. The best way to do all that is through regular meditation. Best way I've found. Finally, we need to learn to die. It's not only our thoughts and feelings that are transient, emerging and disappearing over time, but ourselves. We each have our allotted span of years on the planet, some more, some less, and then we return to the nothing from which we came. Learning to accept this simple fact is a difficult, lifelong task, but doing so is the first step in understanding that the self isn't a unique, isolated thing at all, but a product of generations and a being enmeshed within a world, an emergent accumulation of energy and matter, a moment in a cycle, a transmaterialization of stardust, the expression of a vibrant, buzzing universe, a future and a past. Everything dies, but what we do while we live lives on, and our sons and daughters, in the worlds we make or destroy. We're all doomed. That's simply the condition of being born. But it's also the condition that makes a new future possible. Now what? Thank you.
Wow. You know, the first time I heard Roy speak, I thought to myself, he should be doing spoken word. There's a kind of lyricism to his presentation that makes me just fall almost into a trance. And I'm just sort of waiting for him to get up here and then for you all to be snapping. All right, I think most of you know what the next task is, and that's our seminar, right? So I'm going to take this first row right here is our odd row, number 1. And I'm going to ask all the odd rows to turn around and face the even rows. All right, so if this is row 1, even rows next 2, and then 3, 4, so you need to turn around. And the task is for you to basically shape yourselves into some small groups of about 6 or 7 students, all right? And as you do that then, begin this process for about the next 30 to 40 minutes of seminaring on our presentation, on the texts, as well as on the questions and prompts we've given you. Now the faculty are going to help arrange all of this, so I'm looking to you to help coordinate the process so folks can begin. That includes you, Hirsch. All right. You've had some opportunities for great conversations. I'm going to ask you to stop those conversations, bring them to a close. Yes. So, for the next half hour, we're going to have the opportunity for you to pose the questions you want to Dr. Scranton. All right? And I'll wait till everyone gets resettled before I make the next announcement, because the next one's really important. All right, so you ready to get started here? So each of your groups should have come up with some questions that you want to ask Roy, and I hope you did that, or you may have an individual question. But let me tell you the rule that is going to guide your behavior tonight, because I like rules. Oh, very good. I mentioned rules and you all stop. I love that. All right, so we have a great guy. His name is Nick. Nick, where are you? Nick? Oh, there he is. Look at that. Nick is really fast on his feet. And he's going to be our microphone runner, which means that he is going to get the microphone to you as quickly as he can. So what that means for you is that before you start to pose your question, wait till the mic is in your hand. All right? Can we do that? Agree? Aye. All right. All right, Nick, you ready? You're sitting down, Nick. I don't think sitting down works on this one. All right, and let me also warn you. So at some point, Roy's going to stop talking. He's going to stop answering questions. I'm going to whisk him away from here, so there's not going to be time to ask him questions. All right? You need to understand that. I will be like a bodyguard, pushing people out of the way and we will be heading out for him to get his car so we can get back home to that baby. All right? So I just warn you in advance. I'm a kind of big guy. All right. Nick, you ready? Nick's ready. Roy, you ready?
As I'll ever be.
Okay. You all ready? All right.
All right.
Hello there. I had some
Hello.
pretty extreme disagreements with you.
Great.
One of which was, I think, a conflation of socialism with centralization of power as opposed to common ownership of the means of production in some way. But I digress. I want to get to the real tofu and potatoes of what I've been wanting to ask you.
Okay.
I think you have a quantitative analysis of consumption issues in regards to society and accumulation. But I think you're looking at that in reduction of qualitative analyses of production and reproduction of overall political and economic systems. And I think that if you look through that lens, there's very different prescriptions that come out of there, and there's very different root problems of the ecological issue. You were talking about reducing consumption. Why would we need to do that if there's ways we could qualitatively shift production in a way where people could have a luxurious standard of life but still be in harmony with the biosphere? Which is, here's my basic question. How can you justify the quantitative analysis that you're using as opposed to a qualitative analysis focusing on relations of production?
Okay. I mean, I don't have a beef, I guess, with. I mean, consumer capitalism as it exists is like I find it kind of an annoying way of life, but I don't have an ideological problem with it. My problem is with carbon-fueled consumer capitalism because it's dumping because the consumption of carbon, right? The consumption of oil and gas is dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is heating the planet, which is going to radically change changing the world we live in and can potentially kill us all. That's my big problem. That's my main concern. If there's a way to change, modes of production or the way we organize social life, without, if there's ways to do that can address the carbon problem and somehow redistribute wealth so that we all have a higher quality of life and it's not in this sort of quantitative way, I'm all for that. These are enormous questions that I feel it feels a little bit ridiculous to me to say like world socialist revolution, we need to do this, because it's such a huge problem, but I just don't know where else to go with it, with this problem of carbon, right? It's really about our global economy based in oil and coal, right? And that's the key for me. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope so, or maybe, yeah, there's another question.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Jasmine. I am also an Iraq War veteran, and I wanted to know, you didn't really speak that much on the impact of, or actually I don't think at all, on the environmental impact that specifically the U.S. military's actions take or have on the environment.
Yeah.
So, though you mentioned almost all of the tenets of white supremacy, except for active, violent, I'm killing you because you're not white supremacy, you mentioned most of those tenets. So my question to you is, what role do you see demilitarization, specifically U.S. demilitarization, and the deconstruction of white supremacy playing on the preservation of the environment?
I think they're absolutely necessary. So especially, with regard to the U.S. military and its, interconnection with American empire and the way that's built on and founded in a legacy of white supremacy. And the way that that's all also entangled with and built on an extractive approach toward the earth and the resources of the earth, and again, it's running on oil, it's all running on oil, and all these things are interconnected, and there's no, I think there's no way to really get to a place where we are living together within the ecological limits of the earth without getting past or getting over some of these deep cultural and social problems. I'm not necessarily sure I know how to get there, but it seems absolutely necessary to me. Yeah.
You talked about detachment and using meditation to detach from the concept of your own self emotions or the thoughts that are going through you at the moment. And for me, it's always been an issue of contrasting that with being highly engaged with whatever local populace you're in, if it's ecologically or just human. How are we supposed to be detached and maintain that while still engaging our emotions to connect with people around us and to engage our minds into solving these big problems and working together?
Yeah, so my understanding of that idea of detachment and developing a kind of reflectiveness about one's emotions and about one's reactions isn't a process whereby you turn them off. It's not a process whereby you become some kind of some super rational computer with no more connection to other people. Really, what it's about is, to me, slowing down that process of reaction, slowing down the process of feeling a certain way and then acting on it, and then acting on the other person's reaction, and then acting on their reaction to your reaction, and then just participating in this ever spiraling kind of feedback loop. It's about being reflective in the moment and being able to access, being able to own one's emotions and see them, and then access and be conscious of them, and be able to access a kind of collective existence, be able to access a kind of one-on-one encounter, be able to access a more conscious kind of engagement together, that has more options available to it than what might seem at first to be available. You know what I mean? At first, the option appears you have to do this or this, but if you sit for a moment and you're able to reflect and you're able to detach from that emotional reaction, suddenly other options appear, right? Other ways of doing things appear. And that's what I'm talking about there. I'm not talking about getting rid of our emotional life or not having emotions. I'm talking about having those emotions and feeling them and letting action emerge consciously rather than unconsciously.
Hi, thank you. Hi, my name is Nani. I'm also a
Hi.
veteran as well, just like Jasmine. So my question has to do with what I saw in your presentation as a lack of accountability as far as corporations go, as far as
Yeah.
legislation goes, as far as politician goes. I heard a lot in your presentation about individual accountability, which I think we kind of got down pat. But I did not see a lot of accountability as far as the number one producers of pollution, corporations, the military-industrial complex, and whatnot. I didn't see that in your presentation, and I was curious as to why. Because as far as identifying the problem, you got beef with oil, got it. Well, who are these entities putting those like policies and procedures in place, and why did you choose not to highlight the fact that the biggest producers of climate change, the biggest bad guys to say, are corporations, politicians, and whatnot? You kind of skimmed it, but I got the heavy impression that it wasn't like their fault, more of our fault. Thank you.
Yeah. So I mean, I do. Thanks. Yeah. I do. I did talk about the wealthy who are doing most of the polluting, and that's their. And you're right. You're right. It's at a certain point of view, it is just. It's even you can probably reduce it right to less than 100 corporations in the world that are somehow responsible for most of the carbon emissions historically into the present. So it's a certain stratum of corporations and the wealthy people behind those corporations that are to blame, if you want to blame for climate change. I have no disagreement with that. And I'm sorry that wasn't the focus of my talk. I'm sorry that if the fact that wasn't the focus of my talk was disappointing for you, but the focus of my talk wasn't about just figuring out who's to blame for the situation we're in. We can name who that is, we can make a list of the oil companies and the Koch brothers, and we know who these people are. That's not a question to me. We know who they are, but then what? Then what do we do? I mean, I advocate in my talk a revolution, right? Like I don't know what to do besides that, to say that we need to take that power away from them and distribute it among ourselves. And we need to take control of the economy. I mean, if that's our practical solution for this, then that's what we need to do, is to keep them from doing it anymore. I don't necessarily know how to make that happen, but like clearly that's the practical solution, and that's what I'm arguing for. So yeah, let's do that.
I just really want to address my comment to your question. I didn't feel that there was a blaming going on towards anyone, but more that, a little like you mentioned, we already know who the bad guys are, but it's our choices that are giving those people power and money. It's what we do consuming those resources that are making them rich. So it's our choices that will take power away from them. And it's up to us to see how much of that convenience we want to keep, although it's empowering them, and just, sit in our convenient air-conditioned rooms, polluting the environment, saying it's their fault, or saying, no, I'm not going to support that, I'm going to be hot. And then I'm going to try and find ways to deal with this that are in sync with what I believe in, to put an example. So how much are we willing to just be inconvenienced, and how easy is it to just sit down and say, well, it's their fault, but still, I'm using these products, I'm having this way of life that is supporting them. No one is forcing us to consume plastic. No one is forcing us to buy the things that come from somewhere else. No one is forcing us to eat junk food. But we're still doing it. And we can't just blame Big Sugar. We can't just blame Big Pharma. We can't just blame the government. It's really up to us to make choices that are uncomfortable and be willing to deal with that. It's just what I wanted to say.
Thanks.
Given the fact that some of us might have a difficulty in going along with the idea of socialism as the answer to distributing wealth, because there is obviously a lack of wealth distribution, and that we all, that there is that possibility that with socialism you just would be moving all of that wealth into just the hands of politicians instead of hands of, big greedy capitalists, and so given that problem, have you considered, what do you think about alternative types of business forms? What do you think about the role of nonprofits? What do you think about the role of social entrepreneurships in the changing world and the crises that we will encounter?
Yeah, so, I'm not an ardent believer that socialism is a panacea for all human ills. I don't see any way that capitalism as it works is going to, or the way that democracy here in the US and liberalism more broadly are I don't see any way that the current structures of governance and economic distribution and economic organization that are operative on this planet are going to be able to address climate change and address carbon in any substantial way. We've known about this problem as a global crisis for 30 years, and emissions have grown. Oil use has grown. 30 years we've known that this is happening, and capitalism, it's whatever we're doing isn't working, and so if there's going to be some kind of possibility, and let me be clear and let me be frank, I don't, I don't actually think we're gonna do it. I don't think we're gonna fix it. I think we're all totally screwed, and I don't think there's any real reason to hope that we're gonna stop or even seriously mitigate climate change on the timescale necessary, right? But if we might be able to, it's gonna have to come through centralized control over the global economy, because that's the only way we're gonna get off oil. So that I can see, and I'm just a guy. I'm not, I'm not George Soros or whatever. Like, I don't, Vaclav Smil. Like, I'm not an expert on energy infrastructure. I'm just, from this perspective, from what I know about history and from what I've seen with organizations, with nonprofits, with entrepreneurship, with the development of carbon markets and so on and so on and so on over the last 30 years, 20 years, 10 years, like that's all failed, and it's gonna keep failing, and then we're all just fucked. So that's what I think.
Difficult to find meaning then if you are a social entrepreneur or a nonprofit, it sounds like.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Julius. I agree with a lot of the stuff that you said on here. However, I am wondering as to why you didn't emphasize on what role climate change has on immigration today. I don't know if you're aware, but the biggest cause of migration on the North Africa has been attributed to climate change. I know you pointed out the fact that this choices made today will impact future generations, but I felt as though you didn't point out as much as to the people that cause the most pollution aren't those people in sub-Saharan Africa, yet they're the people that are getting affected the most because their lands are now inhabitable, and these people are being auctioned off and sold in Libya. I don't know if each and every one of you guys know, but 21st century slavery is alive and well, and I'm a little disappointed that that was missed, but I like the fact that you emphasized that we needed to start reacting and start acting on climate change, because that's the only way we can tackle it. Amen.
Yeah, I want to thank you for that. You're absolutely right. Climate change is driving migration, and from, in North Africa, Syria, right? It's driving war, Central America. It's changing the world we live in, and it's putting a lot of people's lives at risk, and it's completely destabilizing a lot of people's entire world. And that is precisely why, if we're going to deal with it, we need to deal with it as a global problem with some sense of economic justice and ecological justice forefront in our minds. Because otherwise, what's going to happen is exactly what is happening, which is a turn toward border security as a primary concern. And this goes back to the military question brought up earlier. Border security, militarization, and global campaigns against so-called violent extremism, which just target anybody that the US or whoever calls a violent extremist. And so, what we're seeing now, happening now, instead of addressing global climate change as a global problem, what we see are nations like the US addressing it as a national border problem, as a security problem, as an issue about protecting the people who have from those who have not and have less and less, as the farms go dry up or what have you. And so, yeah, thank you. I didn't talk about that tonight. I talk about that in my book, and it's one of the ways in which the next 20, 50 years are going to be awful and tragic, because I don't see it getting better. I want it to get better. I want us to figure out how to deal with it, but I don't see that happening. Thank you.
We have time for about one more
Hello, my name's Christina. I'm a senior here. And thank you for coming,
Thanks.
and I appreciate you speaking to us tonight. I noticed early on in your book you made a reference to the capitalistic system functioning on finite products, and I was wondering if you're a fan of Annie Leonard and if you know about the story of stuff and do anything to participate in it.
I'm sorry,
Annie Leonard?
I don't.
No, okay.
Okay.
Because she mentioned that, and I'm sorry that other people are a little bit rough on you about what you didn't talk about in your presentation tonight, and I agree with your world socialist revolution theory. It is absolutely necessary because we all share this planet, and we need to work together for the betterment of it, for ourselves and for everyone else on the planet. Thank you
Thanks.
for coming.
That. No, no.
We could do one more.
I'm going to just say, all right. All right, it's your car. It's your trip
This-
home. All right, who
This
is
guy's
it?
had his hand up for the whole time, basically.
All right, our last question. I've been persuaded. Is that what you want? No, she didn't point me.
Yeah. You have to ask her question now. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah. I see that one of the issues with socialism as well as capitalism is that they are based in like measuring economic performance in the same way. That means like we're doing well in the economy. We are building more houses, building more cars, using more resources. So that's why I'm like a little bit concerned about like socialism, but without like some deep change in the structure, in the way we measure performance, we measure being successful, because all of our measures right now are based on how much we spend, spend, either as an individual or as a country. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. There has to be. It's not just a matter of like, trading out the rulers or whatever. Like there has to be a substantial, in order for that kind of transformation to really take effect and be effective, there has to be a deep cultural transformation. Like I said, where we put the idea of ecological harmony above other virtues, above other values, above consuming or producing or, any of these other metrics by which we measure self-worth at this point. I don't know how we would do that, but it seems imperative. Yeah. So, yeah. So thank you all. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions, but I thank you for the hard ones. I appreciate it.
And thank you all. I want to remind you that you are beautiful. You are brilliant. Be safe going home tonight. There are a few brownies and cookies still in the back. And thank you once again. So.